Everyone to our session on surveillance for NTDs, lessons learned and cross-disease implications. My name is Juliet Shami and I'm an associate professor at the University of Oxford and I'll be chairing this session. If you could kindly keep your videos off, then we can save a bit of internet bandwidth, and please make use of the chat and write all of your questions and comments there so we don't miss anything. So just to get a feel for the room, we'll begin shortly with a Zoom poll. Please take a moment, and if you can answer these very brief 4 questions, we'd appreciate it. It should be launched now. If you just look at your screen, wonderful. So we'll give everyone a moment to answer those questions, and when we have about half of the people in the room who've responded, we'll move on. And if Eliana, you could let me know when that's ready, we can share the results. Oh, someone is asking where the questions are. Has the Zoom poll disappeared? So we have a few questions about what your main occupation is, where you're calling in from, whether you have experience with surveillance research studies, and a few specific strategies related to the surveillance approaches we're going to discuss today. Okay, great. It seems to be visible now. So maybe we could go ahead and start sharing some of those results. All right. So we have a pretty good split in the room with individuals that are working on program implementation and research, and we have a few M&E officers with us. Most people would say that they do understand what's meant by surveillance for NTDs, whereas nobody has said that they have no idea what is meant by surveillance. So that's interesting. And quite a few people with us today, which is fantastic because we're very much looking forward to everybody contributing operational research questions in this area, has had some experience on either passive, active, or syndromic strategies for neglected tropical diseases. And a great majority, even though there are a few maybes there, think that it's important that we integrate surveillance to progress towards the WHO roadmap goals. So if you could go ahead and launch a few slides, I think that kind of sets the mood for what we're going to focus on today. So we're here today as surveillance is of central importance to all of our work and what we do, and we need good surveillance systems to accurately estimate disease prevalence, decide when to stop MDA, monitor recrudescence, prevent overtreatment, and integrate into local health systems with cost-effective approaches. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the session today is organized into 3 pre-recorded talks. These are short talks of 8 minutes each that will be played back to back, and they'll be followed by a panel discussion that will open up for audience questions. So we really hope that you're taking notes throughout these talks. The key purpose of the talks today is to introduce different surveillance strategies used for NTDs. And given the very limited time span of our session, we're going to focus only on human surveillance today. The talks are going to address a couple of key questions. How have passive, active, and syndromic approaches been applied for surveillance across NTDs, and which approaches are more disease-specific and which approaches are more suitable for cross-disease surveillance? After the panel discussion, we're all going to break out into 3 breakout rooms where each room is going to focus on only one of these surveillance strategies, and then we will regroup for a debrief. We're really hoping that the breakout sessions will leave you with a framework for designing a surveillance strategy using one or a combination of the approaches presented today. So we want everyone to leave this session feeling a bit more confident on how to design their own research study using one of these surveillance approaches. Next slide, please. Now, we need to provide our session with a bit of a unified focus because we don't want to spend our time defining what is surveillance. So I will share a few definitions for the 3 surveillance strategies that will be discussed today. Active surveillance is surveillance that is initiated for a purpose, where the samples are sought from participants in endemic communities or local health centers, and they're usually used to provide point estimates of prevalence where routine data is not available. Alternatively, passive surveillance uses routine data and standardized case definitions to regularly report cases through existing national health information systems. And lastly, syndromic surveillance uses patient self-reports or symptoms that are collected at regular intervals, not as direct indicators of the disease that we want to study, but instead as proxy indicators of the infection or the disease. One surveillance approach that we're not particularly going to focus on today, but you might see that's not included here, is reactive surveillance, which responds when you have a known case in the community and samples individuals around that known case. Next slide, please. So I'm really pleased to introduce a great lineup of speakers and moderators today from a wide range of countries and working across diverse NTDs. For our speakers, first we have Dr. Emma Harding-Esch, and she's based at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she's the Chief Scientist for Tropical Data and will present an integrated surveillance platform for trachoma. Next, Dr. Laura Sanyonjo is with Sightsavers and will share surveillance strategies for onchocerciasis with a comparison against perhaps quite a different disease of guinea worm. Then Dr. Steffi Knopp, who works at the Swiss Tropical Public Health Institute, will be outlining key questions on schistosomiasis elimination and matching appropriate surveillance strategies to that goal. The moderators are both country program managers and really well-established researchers that will lead the discussion to prioritize our operational research questions. Dr. Jean Bosco is a researcher at the Rwanda Biomedical Center and has done extensive work on different surveillance approaches. Mr. Gilbert Bayenda is from Uganda and works now with the Fred Hollows Foundation and previously with the Uganda Ministry of Health and has had a focus on WASH strategies. And lastly, Dr. Louis Albert Tushante is from Cameroon and is the head of the Schistosomiasis Research Center there, having looked at multiple approaches for monitoring schistosomiasis. So with those introductions, I think we can now go ahead to the talks and then we will regroup for a panel discussion. So thank you, everyone. Apologies, I think we are having a tiny bit of trouble launching the video, but it should be up in a moment. There's still no video on our end. Whether Jess, you could launch Emma's video.
Yeah, sorry, I think I need maybe a different slide deck. The videos don't seem to be in this version. Just 1 second, I might have a different version available.
Okay, yeah, it should just be one pre-recorded video, yeah. So as we're waiting for the video to be launched, I hope everyone is preparing to hear about quite a few diverse NTDs. So Emma, of course, will be focusing on trachoma. Next, we have onchocerciasis and oh, fantastic. We have started.
Hello, I'm Dr. Emma Harding-Esch, and I'm based at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I'm the Chief Scientist for Tropical Data. Today, I'll be talking about passive versus active surveillance for trachoma, when to use which method. I'd like to start by thanking all the Tropical Data partners. Tropical Data is a partnership between endemic countries, their partners, the World Health Organization, and a core team made up of LSHTM, ITI, RTI, and Sightsavers. So trachoma is the leading infectious cause of blindness. It's caused by ocular infection with the bacterium Chlamydia trachomatis. The World Health Organization endorsed strategy for the elimination of trachoma as a public health problem is known as SAFE. Surgery for the late blinding stage of the disease known as trachomatous trichiasis or TT, where eyelashes from the upper eyelid scratch against the cornea. Antibiotics to clear infection, usually distributed through mass drug administration of entire districts, and facial cleanliness and environmental improvement to limit transmission. The number of MDA rounds is determined by the prevalence of trachomatous inflammation follicular, or TF, which is the clinical presentation of ocular C. trachomatis infection. WHO recommends population-based prevalence surveys to determine TF point prevalence estimates and therefore employs an active surveillance approach. Baseline surveys determine the need for trachoma elimination interventions. At least 6 months after the final MDA round, an impact survey can be implemented to determine if interventions have achieved the elimination thresholds or if further interventions are needed. At least 24 months after the impact survey has shown a TF prevalence below 5%, comes the surveillance survey to show whether reductions in prevalence have been sustained. And if the prevalence of TF in 1 to 9-year-olds is less than 5% at surveillance survey, then that district is considered to have eliminated trachoma. For TT, WHO recommends 3 different methods for determining whether the elimination prevalence target has been reached. The first is population-based prevalence, TT-only surveys, and as above, this is active surveillance. House-to-house case searches I would classify as active surveillance too, albeit using a different definition from that which Juliet outlined at the start of this session, as all diagnosed cases of a reported disease in a given area are being sought, but not for the purposes of estimating a point prevalence. And third, a combination of data from multiple adjacent districts, which requires professional statistical advice. And I would classify this as active surveillance as it's making use of survey data. WHO has published the recommended methodologies for these population-based prevalence survey types. As mentioned, the surveys all employ an active surveillance approach. Prevalence is measured at the evaluation unit or EU level, which is generally equivalent to a district to inform programmatic decision-making at EU level. Teams go into the field and examine the eyes of all members aged 1 year or above of selected households from randomly selected villages in the EU. The surveys also enable the collection of water, sanitation and hygiene or WASH data, conforming to WHO UNICEF Joint Monitoring Programme core questions for households. The only difference in pre- and post-MDA surveys is the sample size, as the expected TF prevalence is different. For TT-only surveys, only individuals aged 15 years and above are examined, WASH data are not collected, and the sample size is again different. Tropical Data helps health ministries worldwide to implement these survey methodologies, supporting them from the start to the end of the survey process, with quality assurance and quality control at every step, ensuring the collection of high-quality standardized data. Tropical Data builds on the methods and technologies developed as part of the Global Trachoma Mapping Project. It uses electronic data collection in the field with Android smartphones and a dedicated app, which reduces the need for paper forms and minimizes errors in data recording. Data are sent to a secure cloud-based server for cleaning, analysis, review, and approval by the Health Ministry. Data are received and can be reviewed in near real time, enabling rapid feedback to resolve issues in the field quickly, improving data quality and accelerating the provision of results. Data are owned by the Health Ministry and are accessible only to nominated individuals through a secure web portal. So, are approaches other than active surveillance used for trachoma? Well, before a baseline population-based prevalence survey is conducted, a health ministry may choose to do a trachoma rapid assessment, or TRA, in places where trachoma is suspected to be a public health problem. TRAs are a simple, rapid and cost-effective assessment of the presence of active trachoma and TT to determine whether a population-based prevalence survey is needed. They do not give a prevalence estimate, as the methodology is not epidemiologically robust. It starts with passive desk work, such as reviewing district health event reports for possible TT cases or reports of the performance of trichiasis correction surgeries, or anecdotal sources such as conducting interviews with key informants or focus group discussions. This passive data collection is followed by active surveillance where indicated, visiting selected communities to look for evidence of TF and TT. You could argue that looking at TF is syndromic surveillance, as it is a proxy of ocular C. trachomatis infection. Multiple studies have demonstrated that the correlation between TF and ocular C. trachomatis infection is not strong, especially post-MDA. A WHO informal consultation on trachoma was held in December 2021, which focused on districts where TF is persisting, so never going below the elimination threshold, or recrudescing, where TF prevalence returns to above elimination threshold at surveillance survey after going below it at impact survey. Following this meeting, there is increased interest and funding to add tests for infection and serology to routine trachoma surveys. Tropical Data has been supporting infection testing and serology as operational research in various surveys to date, and is now working to add these to the system as routine to provide an equal, high quality and standardized offering as for routine prevalence surveys for TF and TT. Further discussion on this is in the Trachoma Endgame Challenges Core NTD session if you're interested. In terms of challenges, an immediate one is that what method to use for post-validation surveillance of trachoma. Population-based prevalence surveys are expensive and time-consuming, so a method that can be integrated into existing systems is needed. WHO's diagnostic technical advisory groups are providing WHO with guidance on the utility of new tools to support neglected tropical disease control and elimination, and defining the use cases and target product profiles for the needed diagnostic tools. These outputs will help provide solutions to this challenge to ensure sustainable surveillance. Thank you for your attention. Hello, I'm Dr.
Thank you so much for the introductions. I'm going to be presenting on onchocerciasis surveillance strategies and comparing that where appropriate with Guinea worm. So I'm going to look at the two surveillance systems, look at resources required to implement them, and then thinking through some opportunities for alternative surveillance approaches. So this slide is discussing consideration of the design and operationalization of a surveillance system. So the why, what, when, where, who, and how. So for onco, we're talking about evidence of elimination, and we're talking about interruption of transmission. So the two indicators that are being monitored is infectivity in black flies, which of course are the vector, and then exposure in humans, in particular monitoring antibodies, but mainly in children under 10 years of age. So this then requires laboratory diagnostics and therefore a plethora of technical specialists to implement the surveillance strategy. Now this is in comparison to Guinea worm, where we're talking about eradication. We need a really sensitive system to identify all cases. It has the advantage that the disease etiology lends itself to a very simple case definition, although it is of course now advised that all cases are lab confirmed. And there are a number of more complex diagnostics being evaluated as potential tools to maximise eradication efforts. But of course, really, it's community health volunteers that are able to kind of implement the surveillance strategy as the mainstay. So now if we look at Guinea worm surveillance, What can we learn from other entities? So of course it's about surveillance and containment. The idea is to identify suspected cases within 24 hours of worm emergence so that we can try and stop any onward transmission. This requires a multifaceted surveillance system. So of course we've got the active village level case finding by community volunteers in previous endemic and suspected endemic areas. We've got the strong passive surveillance system with mandatory reporting of a case through routine health systems, and this rumour reporting and monitoring centres for reporting cases, which actually was credited by some for leading to the identification of unknown transmission in Chad. Actually, a literature review that we carried out evaluating the effectiveness of the guinea worm strategy, in particular what can we learn from other NTDs, looked at the effectiveness or highlighted the lack of experimental evidence around the approach, especially the cost effectiveness. And there's also concerns over the specificity. What we addressed, that would need to be addressed if a similar strategy was to be used for surveillance of other entities with a significant morbidity. Now, finally, here we've got onchocerciasis surveillance. This is, of course, quite resource intensive and conducted at specified time points over multiple years. For the human aspect of the surveillance, this is through monitoring of indicators in front or second line communities, which are selected based on the proximity to active breeding sites. So we've got the onco elimination mapping in hypo and mesoendemic areas with purposeful selection of frontline communities and the additional random selection of second line communities. If treatments indicated, MDA starts and sentinel high-risk communities are monitored every 3 to 5 years with a pre-stop MDA after 10 to 15 years of effective coverage. This would then lead to purposeful and random selection of communities through a larger survey as part of the stop MDA evaluation. Now this is really the human surveillance, but of course that's very much in conjunction with the entomological surveillance. Now, a really nice study by my colleague Louise Hamill and others at Sightsavers highlighted the significance of diagnostics as a main cost driver of actual mapping protocol. This is around the onchocerciasis elimination mapping, which is the start of the surveillance, but it's very much thought this would hold true at other stages of the surveillance. So if you look at the large pie chart, you can see that 7%, which is the light purple slice, that is related to laboratory costs, and 31%, which is the dark red slice, is related to procurement costs. But most of the procurement costs are in fact diagnostics. If you look at the smaller pie chart, you can see that 34% can be said that actually is actually related to equipment and supply costs. So is there any other approaches that we could be looking at for onchocerciasis? So of course, active case surveillance is the mainstay, but we've also got passive surveillance, and there have been efforts to better integrate services into primary healthcare and ensure onchocerciasis indicators are reported through HMIS. This is something that can be further strengthened. Then we've also got syndromic surveillance. There is the potential to monitor skin symptoms like itching, like dermatitis, as part of or as a proxy for onchocerciasis recrudescence. And in fact, these are now integrated as part of the WHO integrated skin disease module. So there is potential to look at this to look at this further for future surveillance efforts. Now, finally, if diagnostics is such a cost driver, how can we take advantage of other disease surveys that are ongoing? So we looked at integrated serious surveillance in Ghana using the Trachoma population-based surveys and opportunity to incorporate collection of dried blood spots in children aged 1 to 9 years. The GBS was then analysed using the multiplex bead array CDC, and this was looked at presence of an array of different antibodies for various diseases endemic in northern Ghana. And actually, just a simple mapping of the cluster seroprevalence was really informative. But actually, this map here that we're showing is the findings from a collaboration with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which used the data to input into geospatial models and identify areas where there was a high probability of exceeding 10% seroprevalence. The orange marks you can see are actually for onchocerciasis. So really useful to identify signals informing where MDA may need to continue, but also identifying potential areas of unknown transmission. And in fact, that red circle with the arrow that you can see in the top right, this was actually an area that wasn't known about in terms of transmission, and after further investigations actually led to the start of ivermectin MDA in the area. So I think the limitations of an approach like this, especially for a focal disease such as onchocerciasis, is that that no signal or lack of signal does not in itself verify no disease or transmission. So this particular strategy was in fact using randomly selected clusters, and this would need to be supplemented by the purposeful selection of high-risk communities. So just to reflect and some reflections to take away, could more be done to integrate surveillance of multiple entities or diseases for peri-elimination surveillance, like in that last slide? And can more be done around passive and syndromic surveillance for onchocerciasis? Can it ever be appropriate, and if so, when and where? So just finally, just want to say thank you very much for your time, and I hope some of these slides help with deliberations in the breakout groups later. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you very much, Juliette, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to present about active and passive surveillance and response within our Schistobreak project in Zanzibar. First of all, I would like to highlight that there's excellent WHO guidelines on communicable disease surveillance and response systems that were published in 2006, and that within the new WHO guidelines on the control and elimination of human schistosomiasis, surveillance is mentioned at several places. However, there are no current guiding documents for schistosomiasis surveillance and response. And with regard to a key question that relates to surveillance, I would like to highlight the 5 phases leading to the elimination of schistosomiasis that are indicated in the new WHO guidelines. They start with morbidity control and they finish with verification of elimination. And a key question that I think we need to ask ourselves with regard to surveillance is, when do we stop MDA? Do we stop MDA only once interruption of transmission has been achieved? And then the, of course, logic next step would be post-elimination surveillance? Or would we want to stop MDA after elimination as a public health problem has been achieved to avoid the overtreatment of a mostly healthy population? And if yes, then we would probably need something like a pre-elimination surveillance response intervention to avoid overtreatment, of course, to avoid recrudescence, and to help accelerating interruption of transmission. And with this, I would like to come to the Schistobreak project, our operational research project in Zanzibar that focuses on surveillance response as an intervention. First of all, the Zanzibar Islands, Unguja and Pemba, belong to the United Republic of Tanzania, and we work in the north of Pemba Island. Pemba originally, or like many years ago, has been a place in the world where urogenital schistosomiasis was extremely high, but there were many control interventions that were successful. And over the past 10 years, we were able to document the decrease in prevalences and intensities in line with interventions that was funded by the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation and the Schistosomiasis Consortium for Operational Research and Evaluation. And as you see nicely here, prevalences decrease in school-age children as well as in adult community members. And in 2021, we are around 1% in children as well as in adults. And heavy intensity infections are below 1% already since 2017, and therefore Pemba and Zanzibar as a whole have eliminated schistosomiasis as a public health problem since 2017 already, and are on a good way towards the interruption of transmission. But of course, there are some challenges, and heterogeneity of transmission is among them. So we do have a few remaining areas with very high transmission and mostly very low transmission areas. And I would like to focus on these low-risk areas where we have stopped MDA and now follow a kind of snowball surveillance approach. So that snowball system starts with active surveillance in schools, where we screen all children and treat the positives with praziquantel. Those positive children are then tracked to their homes, where we offer testing and treatment to their family members. They are also tracked to the water bodies they use, where we offer testing and treatment to people that are present at these water bodies, and where we send the snail team to check for the intermediate host snails and molluscicide if needed. In addition, we have passive surveillance and work closely with the HARTS facilities. I would like to indicate this a little bit with pictures. So here we are collecting urine samples in schools that are all labeled with a unique QR code per child that is then scanned with a tablet and ODK software, where we can immediately enter also the point of care results of HemaStix that is testing for hematuria as a proxy for schistosoma hematobium infection in schools, in urine samples. In 2021, in addition to the HemaStix at point of care, we also used a high throughput point of care peak PCR approach. And we took urine samples to the laboratory for urine filtration microscopy. Those positive children were then treated with praziquantel according to their height, and they were tracked to their homes, where we invited family members above the age of 3 years to be tested and treated with HemaStix at the point of care and with urines taken to the laboratory. They were also tracked to the water bodies. Here, rice paddies, where people go for rice farming. Other goes into the water bodies for fishing or for swimming. So there is potential for infection in these water bodies. And here on the right side, you see a member of the snail team that checked for snails. They were present, Bulinus globosus, and now he's spraying against these snails. In health facilities, we trained 2 staff members in the health facilities of our study area. They are now checking for urogenital schistosomiasis symptoms in their patients, and those with symptoms they treat with praziquantel if they are positive for hematuria with HemaStix. Well, and what are our preliminary findings? If we look at baseline and follow-up cross-sectional surveys, we do find that in the low prevalence areas, in schools and communities, we don't see much of a change of a prevalence, which is good because at least we don't have any major recrudescence. And if we look at our randomized surveys versus the risk-based surveillance, we find in the household surveys an overall prevalence in the cross-sectional surveys at baseline and follow-up below 1%. But if we now look at our reactive surveillance in households and at water bodies, we find a much higher percentage of individuals infected. And that really means we do identify positive people with tracking positive children from their homes. Similarly, with HemaStix done as reactive surveillance in households, at water bodies, and in health facilities, we find a higher number of hematuria positive individuals. And to conclude, we can say our findings show that risk-based surveillance can help to identify and treat infected people. SchistoBreak is a research project over 3 years, so we will only calculate the sensitivity of the surveillance approach towards the end of the study. And that will then show us if the surveillance response approach is able to avoid recrudescence indeed, or whether it can also help to accelerate interruption of transmission. In terms of challenges and recommendations, I would like to highlight that it is necessary to conduct regular cross-sectional monitoring surveys to adapt interventions, either to go back to MDA if prevalences go back above a certain threshold, or to continue with test and treat as we do if prevalences are low. In terms of surveillance, I would like to point out that, as I said at the beginning, programs currently lack guidance, but they also lack effective tools for conducting surveillance. And we all know that a surveillance response system is only as good as the diagnostic is used. And for schistosoma hematobium, unfortunately, we do not yet have sensitive and specific point of care diagnostics, so those are urgently needed for monitoring and evaluation in elimination settings, for pre-elimination surveillance at the point of care, and then of course this will be also needed for post-elimination surveillance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Laura, Steffi, and Emma for those great talks. That gives us a lot to think about. With Emma's talk, we were presented with an integrated platform and how different surveillance strategies could be sequentially applied. We heard a bit about multi-pathogen kind of frameworks with the antibody work and Laura's talk, and then how community reporters could be effective surveyors, and then ended with Steffi's talk, where we learned a bit about how to match the MDA context to the surveillance strategy and how the clustering of infections can be an important indicator for choosing your surveillance strategy. So on those notes, I want to invite all of the speakers to please, if you could turn your cameras on, and we will take audience questions now. If you'd like to ask your question, could you please raise your Zoom hand? Otherwise, I will assume that you would like me to read your question from the chat. If you haven't already placed it there, please go ahead. Otherwise, yes, I encourage you to ask your question as well yourself. I can call on you if you have your hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and start because we have a couple of questions. So one is from Michael Marks for Laura about guinea worm surveillance and whether you think incentives played a key role in the community reporters and the surveyors. So do you think that it would have been sustainable or even successful if you didn't pay those volunteers to find cases?
Thanks very much. Obviously, as we know, as we move towards the end game, knowledge of diseases and motivation to find cases kind of decreases. So having that incentive to find cases has obviously supported that surveillance in that sort of setting. I think what's been clear has been there's been a lot of over-reporting because of it, and there has been a lack of experimental evidence to really understand and evaluate the effectiveness of it. Not much out there in the literature doesn't seem to really. It's more anecdotal, observational evidence. So yes, I think it's been useful in terms of keeping up that motivation, but how successful it has been in terms of what cases we found otherwise, I think that's quite hard to actually determine at the moment with the evidence that's there. Anecdotally, yes, but perhaps there isn't that evidence in the literature to confirm that.
And do you think it's worthwhile looking into studies on non-monetary incentives?
I think it would be useful to look at how some of that lessons learned can be used in other diseases. So, for example, where there is kind of morbidity significant morbidities for trachoma or for maybe LF, and see how that sort of strategy could be used with incentivizing the volunteers. But I think it's looking at that balance in the system to make sure that there is not that over-reporting that becomes too burdensome, and then becomes a surveillance strategy that's just not really the most effective. So I think it's really useful to do sort of a more experimental study for those sort of different contexts.
So we have quite a few comments in the chat that I'll let you respond to. And perhaps I'll ask a question to Steffi. So it was quite nice how you highlighted the MDA context. Do you have any inclination about how you'd prioritize those different strategies that you tested? Do you think that one of them was better suited to the elimination context, or is it kind of a free-for-all amongst those different strategies that you tested?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Can you hear me well? Yes, good. Okay. So at the moment we are in the midst of the study. So basically halfway through, we are in the second intervention phase. So I don't have any final conclusions yet. Since there is an operational research study, we have used predefined prevalence thresholds in communities as well as in schools. So it's below 2% prevalence in communities and below 3% in schools would define an area as a low risk area, which I know is quite low prevalences if we think about the new WHO strategies. But given that we rely on a single UN filtration, we assume it's probably even higher. So everything or every area below the threshold would receive that snowball active, reactive, passive surveillance approach. While we of course have a few remaining areas with high transmission, or if you want hotspots, and they would stick to MDA plus snail control plus behavior change interventions. So they really receive a full-blown package. And I don't know if you remember that one slide I was showing
there you would see definitely an impact. And I myself was a bit surprised. I was hoping that the test and treat approach would really help to also reduce prevalences, which we didn't see in our first follow-up. So at the moment, my personal guess would be test and treat is fine to maintain low prevalences. But if we really want to go towards interruption of transmission, we really need to blow everything we have and then have a post-elimination strategy that includes really a good surveillance approach. And for a good surveillance approach, we do need good diagnostics. And the question is whether they need to be point of care or laboratory based, or how this surveillance should look like in general.
Thank you very much, Steffi, for that explanation. I'm going to hop back to, there's an ongoing discussion still about rewards and payments and incentives. And given that Laura made a parallel to trachoma, I wonder, Emma, if you can contribute to this discussion and talk a bit about the passive work in trachoma and whether you've used any incentives or.
Well, as I explained in the talk, the passive occurs mainly in the trachoma rapid assessment. So it would be to try and identify areas that might be trachoma endemic. And so there wouldn't be any rewards as being discussed in the chat for that, because it's still it's using routine data that's available in terms of have there been any cases of trachomatous trichiasis reported or surgeries performed, and in discussions have people seen people with interned eyelashes, or are there children with conjunctivitis, and in that process the teams would go to the most socioeconomically disadvantaged districts and the most socioeconomically disadvantaged communities in those districts, so really biasing towards most likely trying to find the cases. So it's not like the discussion that's going on about guinea worm and the skin NTDs, especially those working towards eradication. Trachoma is different, its elimination is a public health problem, so the purpose is not to get rid of it altogether, it's to decrease the prevalence to below a certain threshold so that people then don't develop the blinding stages later on in life.
So we have quite similar goals with schistosomiasis and elimination as a public health problem. So it's quite interesting to hear about targeting surveillance approaches to either marginalized populations or key populations of interest. And as Steffi mentioned, actually when focusing on high-risk groups may be more or less important depending on as well the prevalence, which is an important consideration. I'm conscious of the time and I'm really happy for the very active and lively discussion, which should continue in the breakout rooms. So everyone now is going to be automatically split into a breakout room. And the room that you're in is only going to focus on one surveillance strategy. It may be one that you agree with or disagree with, but we have a few dimensions that we'd like you to discuss that surveillance strategy in the context. We'd like you to think about it in the context of what MDA stage of an NTD you're considering it in, whether there's any MDA or no MDA, in data and design, what kind of sampling approaches you'd use across NTDs for that surveillance strategy, and what existing country guidelines there would be. So we'd like everyone to focus on human surveillance, and we hope that you have a great breakout and that you leave that breakout a bit more confident in designing your own research study and surveillance. But we'll regroup here in about 30 minutes. And otherwise, thank you everyone so far for joining, and we'll see you soon. Back everyone to the main session. I hope you guys had a lot of interesting discussions. I want to ask the moderators of each breakout to please post your EasyRetro link in the main chat so that everyone can see the EasyRetro boards of the other breakout sessions and have a look there. Feel free to continue writing in the EasyRetro boards, as we'll put that together later for a report. And we'll have the moderators of each session come forward for a few minutes to share the main messages of their breakout session. So could we please start with Gilbert? You're on mute.
Thank you. Laura was helping me out with that. I think she's posting it. But we had a lot of discussion around diagnostics. As I wait for it to be put up, about diagnostics, integrating diagnostics, perspectives from trachoma, perspectives from schisto and onco, but mainly a lot of contribution around diagnostics. We had a lot of contribution around reporting systems and being passive surveillance, the issue of if it's community level and if it's at facility level, what kind of cost effectiveness we would be looking at. We also had a discussion regarding the relevance of multiple pathogen tests. And we had some experts in the room, and we looked at where we are going, where we are at and where we are going, and whether certain technologies would be easy to deploy in a passive surveillance context. I hoped the board would be up here. I don't have it yet, but most of our discussion dwelt on those areas. And we managed to post it in the retro. And I think when we share it, members from the other teams can appreciate the participation of the passive surveillance team. Thank you.
So could you share, you've covered quite a few topics. Was there any consensus among those topics? Could you share a couple of take-home messages? And for everyone else, it's Laura Sanyonjo who's posted the Easy Retro board from the passive session.
I wish I could see it right there. Passive, okay. So I wouldn't say consensus, but I would say a lot of discussion. Considering there was no opposition, that is what would qualify it as consensus. So most of the discussion was around what can be integrated in terms of surveillance approaches. And we agreed that you would find that malaria and especially NTDs that are diagnosed at, that are easy to diagnose at facility could be easily integrated. And then there are those NTDs that require a bit more rigor. And there we still had a discussion. When we talked to, secondly, the take home, when we talked about cost effectiveness of using different data sources, we agreed that we need to define effectiveness before we talk about cost effectiveness. So this is those are the two take homes that come to mind immediately.
Well, thank you very much, Gilbert. Louis Albert, can you tell us a bit about what was discussed in the syndromic surveillance?
Yes. Regarding the syndromic discussion, we discussed also about the symptom. We have the example of the different disease. We also noticed that some symptoms are not specific to a disease, or sometimes when you have the result based on the syndromic surveillance, there is a need to have a complementary strategy to confirm the presence of the disease. There were also discussion, especially for some disease where we have ongoing mass drug administration like schisto, where some of the symptoms reduce significantly after a year of treatment. It becomes difficult to properly assess this using only syndromic approach. Then for some other disease like trachoma, syndromic surveillance seems to make sense for post-elimination setting. Other disease, syndromic is more appropriate before the intervention. So at different stage of your intervention, you might have more effectiveness of this approach or complementary approach of the disease. We also discussed about the cost, but so far we have nobody shared the experience of the cost of this. Yeah, so there was quite an interesting discussion. Then if you have other thing to add, it's good, Juliet.
No, I think you've really covered mostly everything. I thought it was quite interesting. I was in that session, how there was a lot of discussion about having syndromic surveillance be the broadest sweep approach that you use and being really okay with the overestimation and the lack of specificity. So in syndromic surveillance, when you really do not want to miss a case. So I thought that was quite an interesting contribution from a few people within the group, but you've made all the main points. I'm just repeating. So
Okay.
Our last session then that we need a report from is going to be from Jean Bosco, and he probably had this session that most people are familiar with, or the strategy, I should say, on active surveillance. So what were the key discussion points and operational research questions that came up in your group?
Thank you very much. Yeah, we mainly discussed about the integration, and the integration mainly was really a point we discussed mainly. As we know, entities are diverse, and each disease has its specificities. Then try to integrate the evaluations of those diseases is quite challenging sometimes. But some diseases we found they are really very easy to integrate, like the case of Rwanda have been integrating. This is the case I shared it in the discussion. We integrate Schisto and STH mapping, where we managed to at least to map geographical locations adjacent to water bodies. And then from those areas were the ones also mapped for Schisto as well as for STH. We found that it is quite challenging some, and even we looked at the sensitivity of rapid tests as well as the cost effectiveness of some design. That's why we focus on this specific component of sampling. But also we discussed about existing guidelines. We have also like malaria activities, even in some active interventions that are being conducted regularly, where we can also integrate this active surveillance of entities. I can hand over probably to Emma for additional comments, discussion that we had in the breakout room. Emma?
Thank you, Jean Bosco. So as you said, the most discussion was around integration, and in terms of operational research or further work that came out of the group, we talked about perhaps trying to create a review of case studies of existing integrated surveillance examples, as well as creating a landscape analysis of different surveillance programs, ongoing kind of longitudinal versus cross-sectional surveys, so that we can really try and unpick some of the questions that we were having in terms of which methods work in which contexts, what are the challenges, but also the benefits, for example, cost effectiveness and cost savings of integrated active surveillance, and then in particular, how do programs overcome the issue of differences in sampling strategy, and perhaps how do those discussions around which disease takes precedence over another, if they've got different sampling strategies, which one to go for. There was some discussion around active surveillance and which context, and generally active surveillance is considered less feasible post-validation due to the time and expense, and so post-validation, a more integrated approach would be more appropriate.
Great, thank you, Emma and Jean Bosco. Do we have any final comments or contributions from the audience? Would anyone like to add their thoughts or have any further questions that they'd like to put forward? If you could just raise your hand or type in the chat. Jean Bosco, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just from the presentation of Steffi, I really like the point about reactive surveillance, though it was not really the focus of the present discussion, but I found it very important mainly for schistosomiasis. Schistosomiasis is very focal, and people who are getting at the facility to get screened are mainly very few compared to the people who are affecting the community. So if within this context, at least we have a case of schisto, and we go in the community to look at other houses surrounding the case that we found, we can at least track even those areas that we found they are really they have a low endemicity. We can track the cases that they are there so that they cannot remain the community transmitting the disease. I like the specific point around the reactive surveillance, and I think in our guidelines, as we are planning to eliminate schisto as a public health problem, we can take this approach in our guidelines so that it can be comprehensive in looking for cases in the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean Bosco. I saw that Kelly had her hand up. If you want to unmute, Kelly Callahan.
Thank you very much. This was an excellent session. Gilbert's did a fantastic job in our breakout session on passive surveillance. And Michael Marks made a really good point during that session that no matter what surveillance system we're looking at, effectiveness in terms of that system towards that disease orientation has to be paramount. So in all of the research questions that we might ask, effectiveness has to be at the top of the list. And what might be effective for the guinea worm eradication as an eradication program might be very different in terms of surveillance for a control program. So I think that also is something that we didn't really talk about much, but the tenets of eradication strictus versus elimination as a public health problem is something that should be part of this discussion as these research questions move forward. Thank you, and thank you all for organizing.
Thank you for that contribution, and such an important point that just because the MDA context has been matched to the surveillance strategy for one disease doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case when you want to take it and borrow it for another disease. And we need to redefine it and actually focus on this concept of effectiveness by disease. But hopefully we can still find some common threads here today, even though we've seen that some things are a bit more disease specific. We've talked a bit about at what stage MDA comes into play. The surveillance strategy by MDA comes into play, but we still have a bit more time for a few more questions. If anyone else would like to contribute, otherwise I might just call, because I think following Kelly, I also might call out somebody from our group who I think had a really good contribution on how you think about the modeling and surveillance strategies. So Luke, I was hoping you might comment a bit about thinking about symptoms in the context of different diseases, if you don't mind, and share your thoughts that you had shared within our group. Sorry about that.
I'll try. Thanks, Juliet. So the comment I made was about the value and effectiveness of syndromic surveillance depending on the temporal relation between infection and disease itself, but also the temporal dynamics of infection during control and after control efforts. And some of the examples I named were for instance, onco as being a very slowly recrudescing disease versus say STH, which is comes back more quickly if it remains present. Another point that I highlighted is that looking at intensified disease management entities like VL, we can learn from those as well, because they are mostly actually monitored through syndromic surveillance, though a pitfall is that when you just focus on counting syndromic cases, there is a potential for perverse incentive of underreporting, which has happened in the past in the case of VL. If for some reason the rapporteur of those numbers feels or can be punished by the system, that is a problem. So we need you would need independent metrics of the actual surveillance effort. For instance, the detection delay, the time from onset of symptoms until diagnosis, or maybe the number of people that were actually had symptoms and were screened for the disease, which is another independent metric of surveillance effort. Was that what you had in mind for me to share, Juliet?
Yes, I was hoping that we didn't leave out the modeling, so when people look into future studies, they can start thinking about some key dimensions and characteristics. And thank you very much for sharing that, Luke. And on that note, I want to thank everyone for being part of this session, especially the Core NTD team for helping us organize the Global Schistosomiasis Alliance, and Charles McKinsey in the background for being our rapporteur. I really hope that we've left you with a lot of food for thought and that you will go on to design a research study on surveillance, hopefully incorporating one or multiple of these strategies and identifying some of the gaps that we talked about today. There will be a session report available in about a month or two, but otherwise, thank you everyone for joining our Core NTD session and giving your valuable feedback. So thank you.